They were the only army in history that men were afraid to touch.
To the French Empire, they were a nightmare. To Hollywood, they were legends. But to the Kingdom of Dahomey,
they were simply mother.
They married death.
History is often written in the blood of men, their wars, their conquests, their empires. But in the shadowed heart of West Africa, in the 18th and 19th centuries, terror wore a different face. It was a face that European colonial powers, armed with cannons and arrogance, could not comprehend. A force that struck silently in the night, leaving decapitated French legionnaires in its wake, their eyes frozen in a final moment of disbelief. They were the Agojie, the elite warrior caste of the Kingdom of Dahomey. The world came to know them as the Dahomey Amazons, but they called themselves something else. They were the Mino, our mothers. And to become a mother of Dahomey, you first had to become a bride of death.
The Kingdom of Dahomey existed in a constant state of existential dread. Surrounded by powerful enemies and reliant on the brutal economics of the transatlantic slave trade, Dahomey needed perpetual warfare to survive. King Ghezo, who ruled in the early 1800s, faced a critical shortage of male soldiers. His solution was radical. He turned to the only untapped resource he had left, the women of his kingdom. The Agojie were not volunteers in a modern sense. They were captured rivals, rebellious daughters traded by fed-up fathers, or girls taken as tribute. Once they entered the palace gates, their former lives were incinerated. They took a sacred vow of chastity. They were officially deemed the king's wives, the Agojie, but this was a marriage in name only. To touch an Agojie with treason, for an Agojie to become pregnant, was a capital offense, punishable by execution for both her and her lover. They were stripped of their femininity, their reproductive purpose, and reforged as instruments of the state. They were married not to a man, but to the concept of lethal duty.
The transformation from captive woman to elite killer was designed to break the human spirit. The training made Spartan Agogies look merciful. Pain became their primary language. They ran through walls of acacia thorns, the 2-inch spikes ripping flesh from bone. To show weakness, to flinch, was to fail, and failure was often terminal. They practiced scaling walls lined with spikes. They wrestled one another with a ferocity that frequently left combatants maimed. But physical toughness was only half the battle. The true objective was the eradication of empathy. In the final stage of initiation, dubbed insensitivity training, recruits were forced to execute prisoners of war. The hesitation to take a life was beaten out of them until the act became mechanical, a chore. By the time they graduated, they were no longer women in the eyes of their society. They were men. They were allowed to drink alcohol, smoke tobacco, and reside in the king's innermost circle. They had traded their humanity for prestige. In battle, the Agojie numbered up to 6,000 at their peak, nearly a third of Dahomey's army. They were shock troops designed for psychological terror. European observers noted that while the male soldiers of Dahomey would sometimes hang back, the women always led the charge. Their tactics were based on speed and surprise. They favored the musket for initial shock, but their true prowess lay in close quarters combat. The measure of an Agojie's success was the trophy she presented to the king. Decapitation was standard procedure. The more heads, the higher the status. They became merchants of death in an economy fueled by human captivity. They were the hunters who procured the slaves that Dahomey sold to the West. They were both victims of a brutal patriarchy and its most enthusiastic enforcers.
a dark paradox that defined their existence. By the late 19th century, the scramble for Africa brought the French Empire to Dahomey's doorstep. The French did not see warriors. They saw savages hindering colonial expansion. They expected a quick victory. At the Battle of Cotonou in 1890, the French legionnaires formed defensive squares, unleashing devastating volley fire. Against this wall of lead, the male soldiers of Dahomey faltered. The French were stunned into temporary paralysis. They had never encountered an enemy, male or female, with such disregard for their own survival. The Agoji charged the French lines repeatedly, some managing to break through and engage in hand-to-hand combat with bayonet-wielding soldiers. It was courage against technology, flesh against machine guns. The outcome was inevitable, but the price the French paid in blood and psyche was catastrophic. By 1894, Dahomey fell. The kingdom was annexed by France. The Agoji, as a military unit, ceased to exist. Most died in the final battles. But what happens to a woman built for war when peace is forced upon her? This woman, known as Nawi, was interviewed by historians in the mid-20th century. She claimed to be the last surviving Agoji, having fought the French as a teenager. She lived in poverty, a relic of a vanished world. She spoke of the glory of the past, but also the profound emptiness. When the king was gone and the war was over, the wives of death were left widowed by their own purpose. The legacy of the Dahomey Amazons is a difficult knot to untie. They are celebrated today as icons of female strength and anti-colonial resistance, the real-life inspiration for Hollywood legends. But the truth is darker, wetter with blood. They were the elite guardians of a slave state, women who achieved power by perfecting the art of slaughter. They proved that courage has no gender, and neither does cruelty. In the end, the women who married death found that it was the only vow they were ever truly allowed to keep.
Please like and subscribe.